Okay, welcome everyone. Just looking at the list of attendees, I'm kind of getting my own anxiety levels are rising, looking at people who probably know as much about this as I do. So hopefully there'll be something in it that will be of interest. So as Una said, I'm a psychologist with CAMS and Swords and past president of PSI from last year. So in terms of anxiety and teenagers, what we're going to focus on today, the main thing about anxiety is, and I think the key piece, is that it's worry about fear of real or imagined circumstances. So for lots of young people, it is an imagined anxiety that they're worried about, but it has the same physiological and cognitive effect on them. So irrespective of whether it's real or imagined, it still makes them feel quite overwhelmed. One of the greatest challenges about anxiety is what it feels like is having no filter on your brain, that you're bombarded by thoughts constantly. Most of those start with the sentence, what if? So when I'm working with a young person who might be struggling with anxiety, I specifically say to them, tell me about your what if thoughts. And many of them will be a bit surprised that I know that they have them, but most people who struggle with anxiety will start with what if thoughts. So that's a useful stepping stone to get them to talk about potentially the things that are worrying them. But it's not just about the thoughts that get bombarded, that swirl around in the brain all the time. It's also what it feels like. And anxiety, more than any of the other emotions that we feel, has such a huge physiological effect on us, on the body. So as we were just mentioned, the mind would be racing. We feel a little bit dizzy, difficulty sleeping, the heart pounding, the tummy going around in knots like a washing machine, shaking. And particularly with teenagers, they get very, very conscious of the leg shake, and they worry that someone's going to notice it and think that they're weird or strange or there's something wrong with them. So that the trembling in the knees is one that they really, really get anxious about. So when you combine being bombarded by lots and lots of what if thoughts along with the physiological reaction to it, it is something that people want to get away from. The difficulty with anxiety is it's an emotion, and if you bring from one corner of the room to the other, you bring it with you. So I would work with people sometimes when I ask them what their goal is, and it's not to feel anxiety. And unfortunately, that's not possible because it's an emotion. And it's part of the package that we all have. So happiness, anger, fear, disgust, worry, it comes together. And I show this image to young people that they have a wish that they could just cut off some of the more difficult emotions and just feel the ones that feel okay. But when we turn on a tap and we allow ourselves to feel, then we open ourselves up to all of the emotions and they all come together as one big package. So specifically looking at teenagers, the issues that make them most anxious are still the issues that occurred when I was a teenager. And it's that sense of, am I good enough? Am I good enough for myself, for my friends, for my family, for others? It's that self-doubt that plagues them as they go through adolescence and their development of trying to figure out who their identity is. And with this being at the core of it, a worry, a doubt, a fear that I'm not good enough. So the kind of things that they worry and they fear about are much more common to kick off in adolescence versus younger children because of all of the other changes that are going on in the body, the brain, the emotions. During adolescence, the body goes through such significant changes because of hormones and growth, but they worry about all of these things all the time. So drink, drugs, sex, what age do I start talking about it? What age do I do it? Do my friends are talking about it? Do I believe them if they're doing it? How do I fit in? So if they're going down the field with cans and I don't want to go with them, what do? I don't want to do it, but if I don't go, will they, exclude me? And again, that fear of not fitting in, that fear of exclusion drives so much anxiety in teenagers. An interesting one that comes up a lot for kids who get anxious is they really fear throwing up at school. And that could be for a variety of different reasons, the sense of shame or embarrassment about what's wrong with them. For teenage girls, what's come a lot with, if I throw up at school, are my peers going to think I'm pregnant? And that's even if they've never been sexually active, it's still fear. Am I throwing up at school because maybe they think I've got an eating disorder? So they will project all these anxieties into other people. They worry, and we've got huge standards and expectations on young people over the last number of years, academically or for sport, that they have to be perfect, whatever that means, at all things at all times. Again, worrying how they look in the age of Instagram and social media and making comparisons with peers, worrying about body image and if that body image fits or matches or reaches the standard that they think other people have expected of them. One of the things that we've experienced in CAMS over the past year or so is a massive, I would guess somewhere in the region of 200 to 300% increase in the number of young people presenting with body image anxiety and eating disorders. So this fear of how they look and anxiety that my body isn't good enough is something that they're increasingly focused on. But again, they will still focus on the right clothes, the right phone, who the right friends are, what their social media profile looks like. So there's a huge amount of things that they feel that they have to get right in order to fit in and to be accepted. And a lot of them, when they experience self-doubt, feel that they can't achieve this, which can cause them to withdraw on themselves. So especially in I'm trying to think how many slides I could get through without mentioning COVID, and I think I have to now. Everybody's anxious right now. We're anxious. People on this call are anxious. I'm anxious. And that's a normal reaction to the events that we've had. And particularly in the run-up to a return to school next Monday, we're going to see increased levels of anxiety. And in many, many cases, that's a normal response to the threat that's there and changes that are going to occur. So when we need to pay attention to it is if the young person needs constant reassurance from us or from their peers, if they're increased irritability, and again, bearing in mind they're teenagers, being irritable is a baseline for them most of the time. If they're excessively tired, anxiety is, and struggling with anxiety is one of the most exhausting difficulties that you can have, because your brain is in fifth gear all the time. You're struggling to manage the physical aspect of anxiety, predicting the future. It takes a huge amount of emotional energy. But also where they want to avoid everyday situations, and again, in a pre or post-COVID world, that they would normally have looked forward to, going to school, going out with their friends, engaging in sport. So the key piece is the anxiety consistently gets in the way of everyday life. Not a day here and there, not an isolated incident where they just don't feel like it, where they consistently withdraw from things that they used to engage with and enjoy. One of the things that I want to talk about for the kind of core part of this is social anxiety, because of all the different forms of anxiety that a young person can experience, within the teenage years, social anxiety is the one that's the most prevalent, but also the one that impacts on them the most. So with anxiety and with social interaction with our peers, there's a big difference between social anxiety, shyness, and introversion that I think it's important for us to bear in mind. So for introverts, and many people on this call, at times I'm quite an introvert, despite how much time I spend on Twitter, introverts do enjoy time alone. And they're quite happy. So sometimes you will see a teenager, and as an adult or a parent, we might expect or think or assume that because they're on their own, that they're lonely or they're sad or they're anxious. Sometimes they're perfectly happy just to be introverted. An introvert needs less stimulation than an extrovert. One or two friends is generally loads for them. They don't need lots and lots and lots of friends, and they wouldn't really be into large parties. They tend to be quite good at concentrating, so they're happy spending times on their own, doing one task that they really get into. Introverts can do small talk, but they rather get into a topic that they're interested in and really dig into it. They can often be characterized as good listeners. They do have social skills, but they have a limited amount of social energy. So if they have to be sociable for a long period of time, that energy tends to run out. So they will guard the supply and use it in situations where they enjoy that situation, not just going out and being social just for the sake of it. So being an introvert is a state of being. It's just how a person is, and it's not something that needs to be addressed by a psychologist or something you need to be concerned about. When we look at shyness, that's also quite different. Introversion, again, is a state of being, whereas with shyness, it's a fear of social disapproval or being humiliated within a particular situation. So what shyness is a response to the situation that the person is in. It's not a constant state of how that person is. And it's a social discomfort we feel when we worry that, measuring up or feeling awkward, which for teenagers, worrying about measuring up is a consistent thing that they feel in order to try and fit in with others. Everybody can get shy from time to time. Again, it's situational. Some people find shy as just a personality characteristic, a quirk. And again, it's not something that we need to necessarily address or certainly speak to someone like myself or many people on this call about. But we need to look at the differences, social anxiety versus shyness. It's like shyness on steroids because it's constant, it's bigger, it's more debilitating. So when I give a version of this talk in schools, and I think to some of the teachers on this call I've been in their schools, it's the third most common mental health problem in the world. And I wonder after COVID whether it might actually move up to second or first. The first two would be depression and substance misuse difficulties. But certainly over the past year, and I know from colleagues in Jigsaw and other agencies, the amount of anxiety that young people are experiencing has increased exponentially. So some basic facts about it. Average onset is about 13 years, and not coincidence, that's always around the time where a young person transitions into secondary school. So they've come from a primary school environment where they've had a lot of consistency, predictability. And anxiety doesn't like uncertainty. It likes routine. It likes things to be the same. So in primary school, we have one teacher, one classroom, the same peers, the same chairs, everything is the same. We transition to secondary school and we've got up to 11 different subjects, 11 teachers, we've got lockers, we've got a plan for our books, we've got different peer groups, and we've got people who generally aren't as accommodating of difference as sometimes we are in primary school environments. So there's a lot of change going on, and again, changes in hormones and how the young person is functioning. So about 75% of people who experience social anxiety have an onset between 8 and 15. So those teenage years are the time where a young person is most likely and at highest risk of experiencing severe social anxiety. Over a 13 to 18-year-olds, but 9.1% have social anxiety disorder, so reaching a clinical level of concern about it. And about 1.3% would be severely impaired. In Ireland, some of the early research has found about 5.1% have had it, and at 16.7% at any point in the lifetime. So it is a very common difficulty that people experience. So in terms of understanding a bit more about it, it's classified of one of fear, embarrassment, or humiliation in a social performance situation to the point where the person avoids them. And this is the key piece. We all get a little bit anxious about giving talks, presentations like this, but usually it doesn't get to the stage where we will avoid it because of the level of anxiety. Or if they can't avoid it, then they have to endure it with a high level of distress. And I would see a lot of young people who would get very socially anxious in school. Avoiding school and not going isn't really an option, so they can get through it, endure it, survive it, and then they get home and they just sleep because they're wrecked from the emotional energy that they've needed to endure that anxiety while being in school. So what a person really wants to do is create a favorable impression of ourselves to others. But when we really struggle with our self-esteem or our self-concept, as many teenagers do, we're really insecure about how good or able we are at giving a positive impression for others. So really, for many teenagers who struggle with social anxiety, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. They want to fit in, but they don't believe that they have the skills or the ability to do so. So in terms of the typical situations that might provoke a social anxiety, using public transport can be a common one. So for some parents, they might get a little understandably frustrated at the mommy-daddy taxi having to bring them everywhere. Sometimes that might be the fear of using the transport. Again, magnified by COVID, in the past year or so. But what if I get on and someone from my school is there? What if I get on and I sit down and then nobody sits beside me? What happens if I see someone and they laugh at me? Because it's a confined environment, and many young people would have this fear of, I just have to get off, or I just won't do it at all. Public toilets, I've a lot of young people who will not use the toilet in public places, and particularly in school. They will literally hold it until the end of the day because of fear of how many times I'm going to the toilet, what they think I'm doing, if someone hears a noise and they laugh at it. So they will avoid going. Walking into a classroom where maybe 2 or 3 people have already been in there or talking. What if I go in and they don't talk to me? Dating is an anxiety. What if someone says no? And in particular, the school environment. The amount of conversations I've had with young people where I've said to them, if you could go back to school and there was nobody there with the teachers, would you be as anxious? And in many cases, the answer would be no. And that really highlights to them that fear of judgment by their peers. We also know over the past year, it's been very intermittent in terms of getting access to the physical school environment, transitions being difficult. There is likely to be some degree of anxiety of young people who are anxious about going back on Monday. I certainly had a conversation with a mum yesterday who told me there is no way she's going to get her teenage son back to school on Monday because the anticipatory anxiety is so high right now. She thinks it will be so overwhelming for him. So it's not that school is a bad place, but the anticipation for the young person of going and the fear of judgment that's there for them can feel so debilitating that they feel that they can't manage that. There are situations that can provoke it. Social media is a big one. Sending a text, editing it back and forward. Do I have the right word? Do I not? Will I get a response? This fear of getting ghosted from their peers if nobody replies back to them. I have many young people when I'm trying to support them to interact with others. The idea of ordering a coffee in a shop would terrify them to get their friends to do it. So one of the early tasks I would do with them is to get them to order a Chinese on a Friday night, and we'll write out a script in advance, but they would still be worried, but what if they ask me something else? And they worry about the uncertainty and the unknown. Instagram, when I do an initial intake with a young person, I'll talk to them about their social media activity. And you can learn a lot about anxiety and also self-concept by how they use Instagram. So for the kids that have the lowest self-esteem or the highest level of anxiety, they will very rarely post any pictures of themselves. They will post things, if they post at all, because they worry about people seeing that image and judging them for it. So they would generally just use it for chat with their friends, like a text, rather than image. Again, worrying about being ghosted, someone not replying. So for those of you who use WhatsApp, when you see that someone has got the blue tick, they've read the WhatsApp, most of us can manage that they haven't replied, and we don't panic that they don't want to be our friends anymore, they've left us, I'll be alone. Many teenagers will catastrophize that they've left me, they've abandoned me, they've picked somebody else, rather than maybe they've no credit, maybe they're in the shower, maybe they're asleep, maybe they're busy. So that can feel very, very anxiety provoking for them. And again, the selfies, I would mess sometimes with teenagers and say to them, so I presume when you take a selfie and you put it on Insta or on your story on Snap, you just take the one and you throw it up, and they look at me like I'm mental, knowing that they don't, that they take many, because they have expectations that it needs to be perfect. But because they're trying to appeal to a huge, wide audience on social media, they feel that anxiety that the image or the image of themselves and the projection of themselves and their identity, they can't get that guarantee that everybody will like it. And even when they do post a picture on Insta and you see the thread and lots of people comment on it and tell them how gorgeous and stunning and everything they are, when you ask them if they believe it, very rarely do they. They just see it as something that people say. But if you ask them when they comment on someone's Insta, do they mean it? They always do. But they feel that people will treat them differently than they treat others. One of the most anxiety-provoking times for a young person, or for anyone really, is late at night in their bedroom, when they're not busy, they're not active, when they think that they can just go off to sleep and their brain will quieten down. Because they're not busy, there's nothing to distract them. So a lot of those anxious thoughts will flood back in. They will think back on social interactions they had during the day. They would criticize themselves. Why did I say that? I can't believe I said that. I'm such a fool. They're going to laugh at me. And they will reanalyze over and over again those conversations, but only picking out the things that they perceive or assume were negative, and assume that the other person noticed it and thought the same. On top of that, then they will also be thinking about the next day. What if I see this person? What if they laughed at me? What if they don't want to talk to me after what I said yesterday? What if I go in and everybody ignores me? So they're caught between the past and what might happen, and it can really, really impact on their sleep because they over and over analyze, but unfortunately only through a negative lens. So in terms of the three stages when a young person gets socially anxious, there's the before, when they dread it, the during, when they fear that they embarrass themselves, and then the psychological post-mortem, where they have an afterwards. So before, and again in a post-COVID, or hopefully in a post-COVID world, when they get to go out again, in the advance of an event, they get activated in terms of a negative sense of themselves, and they worry about, what if I go to the nightclub? What if I go to the academy or to Mango's and nobody talks to me? I fall, I trip, I get sick. They can only predict the worst possible thing, which is known as catastrophizing. This period of anticipatory anxiety is all about the perceived danger, and again, this potential for negative evaluation or judgment of us. So they would plan for safety. How can I do this without feeling anxious and protect myself from judgment? And in many cases, it would mean avoiding the situation entirely. The perception then is I've protected myself from this bad thing happening because I didn't go. In reality, all that they've done is reduce their level of anxiety. So the main focus during a situation is to avoid anything that others might perceive as embarrassing because of the judgment that would bring on the person. So during any social situation or a situation where a young person feels anxious, one of the additional difficulties is that they expect high standards of performance. They expect perfectionism of how they are in that situation. And they will make assumptions that people will think of them if they act in a certain way. So again, rock in a hard place. If I say nothing so I don't embarrass myself, then people will think I'm boring and have nothing to say for myself. If I say too much, then they'll think I'm full of myself. So what do I do? And they really, in most situations, they'll avoid it rather than risk having to choose one or both of those situations. During a situation where they feel anxious, it can activate an awful lot of internalized thoughts about the self, which, as you can see, tend to be almost exclusively negative. So they're trying to have a conversation with a peer or groups of peers, and they're thinking, I'm so stupid, I'm weird, I'm weak, I'm boring, I'm skinny. And they're also thinking that this person is judging me and they're being bitchy and judging me. So they're caught between two negatives, all about the self. They also become extremely preoccupied. So when a young person becomes really anxious in a social situation that someone will think I'm boring, they focus all of their attention inward. So they focus on their pounding heart, their stomach going around in knots, and they feel that very, very strongly, as well as their racing thoughts. So they become extremely self-conscious. And then they're not paying attention to the conversation outside of them and not joining into it. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I worry that someone is going to think that I'm boring because I've nothing to say for myself. So I focus all my attention inward, don't contribute to it, and then they end up thinking I'm boring. So it becomes a significant trap for that young person. They also engage in lots of very, should is one of the most dangerous words for a young person when they get anxious. I should be this, I should be that, I should have said that. And they're constantly judging themselves against some standard that their anxiety has told them they haven't reached. They also engage in mind reading, that they know what another person is thinking. So I've often posed the question to them, if you put two socially anxious teenagers in a room and both of them are thinking that the other person thinks they're boring, they're silly, they're stupid, whatever, and they're both thinking of the other, which one is right? So again, showing to them that they're not able to judge and they're projecting their own anxiety onto others. Another useful tool that I use with them is on a whiteboard, I'll draw an outline of a brain. And I'll ask them to fill in percentage-wise on any given day, what would a teenage girl be thinking about? So they'll put in shopping, clothes, pennies, Netflix, music, and they'll fill in all of the typical things that teenagers would look at. And then we stand back and we look at it and we think, oh, okay, where in that is the room to be thinking about you all the time? Because that's the assumption you've made. And we'll draw another outline of a brain, and that your anxiety tells you that all they're thinking about is you. Maybe that's true, but which one is more likely? And usually they can see and they can acknowledge that. So during the situation, to protect ourselves, or what we believe we're doing to protect ourselves from fear of evaluation, is we engage in safety behaviors. So for some people, that might be asking loads and loads of questions of the other person. What that's designed to do is to keep the focus on ourselves. If I keep the focus on them, it keeps it away from me, and therefore I've protected myself. But in the psychological post-mortem, they look back at it and think, I talked all the time. They think I'm so full of myself. So it actually hasn't made them feel less anxious or protected themselves. Or they will select a position where they think that avoids scrutiny, like sitting at the back of the room, or drinking alcohol with older teenagers to reduce anxiety, or taking drugs because it makes them feel a false sense of confidence. They might also take on situations where they don't have to interact in a social situation. So I'm happy to take the picture so I don't have to stand in it and I don't have to worry about this going on Insta. Wearing a high top or wearing a hair very, very long to cover eye contact so they don't have to worry about being seen. Avoiding eye contact or apologizing constantly. So for a teenager who's really, really anxious, they will always apologize. And when you ask them, what was the apology for? They don't know. And then they apologize for the fact that they've apologized. And when you get into it with them, it's because they assume that they haven't said the right thing. And with me, they think there's a script that I expect them to follow. And if they don't, they get anxious that they haven't done it and said the right thing, so they apologize for it. But again, anxiety wants to take the focus away from us. But when they apologize, when there's nothing to apologize for, it actually brings additional attention on them and additional scrutiny. So safety behaviors that they believe reduce anxiety actually in many cases increase it and bring additional focus that they haven't really wanted in the first place. After the situation, they will ruminate on it, and to the exclusion of all else, it would be negative. I should have done this, I should have done better, and it's all self-critical, but also importantly, it's past focused. So they look back on things and beat themselves up over something that they cannot change. If it did go well, and they had high levels of anxiety beforehand, they can be quite selective in their interpretation of why. So look, or the safety behaviors protected me from the anxiety that I felt. So there's very little situation where there's any self-compassion or where they gave credit to themselves. So quickly, in terms of the why young people feel like this, there may be some genetic or hereditary component. We don't really know. But in many situations, when I'd be working with a young person and I ask them about mum and dad and do they get anxious, mostly they can identify one or another who do get a little bit anxious too. It's also about young persons having a threat perception that's a little out of line. So in Dublin Airport, we have a radar that scans for signs of threat or danger, which anxiety, that's what it is for us. It scans for signs of threat or danger. When it's working properly, we see 3 planes there. It's not overwhelming. There's not much danger, and we don't feel overwhelmed. However, if a virus was to get into the scanning software and change the sensitivity of it, so suddenly it saw birds as well as planes, then we feel really overwhelmed. We don't know where the danger is. It's there, but we don't know where. And we feel that overwhelmed by perceived danger, our instinct is always to pull away from it. And this in particular is the difficulty with social anxiety, because people are everywhere. People are going to be everywhere when we reintegrate with them. How do we know who's judging us and who isn't? So for so many people, they pull away because the assumption is everyone is judging me, so therefore I can't take the risk. For adults and parents, our own anxieties about our kids can really impact on them as well. So we worry about how anxious they get, and we try to reassure them, we try to reduce their anxiety, we try to tell them that they don't have anything to be worried about. Parents and young people will often come and try to expect that we'll spend loads of sessions trying to figure out the root cause, the one thing that has led this young person to feel anxious. And maybe that is clear. It could be because of bullying or something that was said to them, but sometimes we don't know, and we can, I would argue, waste time looking for the why. So if you're 500 yards out to sea in a boat and you can't swim and you trip over something and you fall in the water, for most people, the instinct is not going to be, did I trip over a cat? Was it slippy? Did someone push me? All we need to do in that situation is, how do I stay afloat and how do I get back in the boat? The why afterwards, fair enough, we can look back and maybe move that bucket. But it's about what we do about it rather than constantly looking for that answer. And for a lot of young people, when we ask them as professionals or parents, why are you so anxious? When they say the answer, don't know, that is the valid answer. And we can maybe sometimes misperceive that and think that maybe they're just too anxious or they don't want to say. But don't know is a valid answer sometimes. So in terms of understanding how it becomes a problem for people, when anxiety builds, it doesn't slowly build nice and easy. They get anxious, they get panicked, and they can panic very, very quickly. And it hits 100 very quickly. Even by doing nothing, over time, it will come back down. However, what they fear is that when it hits about 85, 90, it is so overwhelming. This bad thing must be about to happen, and they need experience relief that brings that anxiety back down. And it does. And what they do is they use avoidance. So they've avoided a situation where they make a prediction how bad it's going to be. And also they get relief from the physiological, their heart slows down, their breathing slows down, and they think, thank God I avoided that because something bad definitely would have happened. So the avoidance itself becomes the maintaining factor. In the next time they're faced with that situation, they think, what did I do last time that made me feel relief quickly? Oh, I know, I got out of there. Let's do that again. So unfortunately, what that prevents them from doing is seeing that the anxiety cannot keep increasing exponentially. It can't keep going up, and also it won't last forever. And when I show young people this slide, I say, how am I so confident that it cannot keep going forever? And they go, I don't know, how? I say, well, are you as anxious right now as the panic attack you had on Sunday? Like, no. Oh, so it can't. So they need a confidence that it will not last forever. I will often also ask them the question, if I can reach inside your head and flick off a switch so you never had to feel anxious again in your life, would you let me? And I give these talks in schools to TYs. About 50% of them will say, yeah, switch it off. Okay. Obviously, I think you may guess this is a setup. So then I'll show them the next slide where they're walking down the street, they hear a noise behind them, and you see this gentleman with pointing a gun saying, give me your phone. We got no anxiety. We go, okay, yeah, here's my phone, and that's a lovely scarf you have for your face mask for COVID. Is that from Zara? Where's that from? If we feel anxious, we hear the noise, we look around, we see him, and we run like hell. So it keeps us safe. For somebody who might anticipate the birth of their first child, we feel anxious. Is it a boy? Is it a girl? Are they healthy? We get anxious about it. And if we don't have anxiety, oh, there's a child. That's mine. Again, it's that anxiety that brings that sense of enjoyment from the occasion. Halloween. What is it makes Halloween so enjoyable for many people? They get excited about it. Oh, how do they get excited? It makes their heart beat faster. They get scared. So it has the same physiological effect as other situations. Teenagers when they're just about to have their first kiss. I've got 2 daughters, so that won't happen until they're 18. But that first moment before the lips come closer, their hearts are beating, their stomach are in knots, their muscles tense up. And I would say to them, does that remind you of anything? And they go, oh yeah, it's the same as when I panic. So we need to see that there's other situations where anxiety actually is enjoyable. So when you talk to them, have you been to the park? Yeah. Did you go on the roller coaster? Yeah. What was it like? Terrified. Did you enjoy it? Loved it. Went back and did it again. Oh. And again, you bring them through the same physiological reaction, and they realize that actually it was fun, because they perceive anxiety as something to avoid, rather than in certain situations they can actually enjoy it. So one of the things that also maintains it is when we as adults invalidate them and we tell them that it will probably never happen. Don't worry about this thing where someone won't talk to you, or your friend will, you won't have a great time. And we tell them, no, don't worry about that. Or that great Irish phrase, that's a disaster with anxiety, it'll be grand. And they aren't helpful. In particular, working with young people who would have phobias about contamination and about sickness. If you would have said to them, it'll be grand, it'll never happen, bad shit happens all the time. Listen to your news any given day, or for someone who fears contamination, telling them it would never happen, and then COVID arrives. So I had a few young people who came back and went, see, I told you bad stuff was going to happen. So what happens when we get anxious is that it's like putting a magnifying glass on the percentage odds of it happening. Most things that teenagers are anxious about are theoretically possible, but they overinflate the percentage chance of it because they're looking through an anxious lens, which makes them believe that it's more possible. So one of the things that we have to do is see whether their anxiety is justified. And in many cases, the anxiety is justified, the worry, the fear is justified, but how they're responding to it isn't, in terms of trying to maybe avoid life. So we avoid judgment. So in terms of what works, again, I think there's some colleagues from Jigsaw here, and I've used their hashtag more often over the last few years than probably anything else. It's the relationship. It's about feeling secure. It's feeling understood. It's feeling validated. It's saying to a young person, that makes complete and utter sense why you feel anxious about that. And they don't expect that from us. They expect us to try and change their mind. But if they're feeling anxious, they're feeling it, and we need to acknowledge and see that feeling. Even again, if the responses aren't helpful, they're still feeling it, and they need to feel connected. They need to feel understood. They need to feel that somebody gets it. So when you tell them, that makes sense, I see how anxious you are, I understand it, that in itself can decrease the level of emotion, because they don't feel alone anymore. When their feeling and worry is that I'm going to be excluded, I won't be accepted, I don't have anyone, getting that one person in this world actually understands me can feel safe. And what it does is it gives them that sense of secure base. And many of you will know about attachment. And when we have a secure relationship with our kids, with our teenagers, be that as a parent, as a therapist, as a sports coach, whatever it's going to be, it allows that young person to go out into the world, to experience rejection, to experience failure, and to come back to a place where they know that there is no judgment, that there is unconditional positive regard and unconditional love. And it allows them to go out and keep going out and coming back to that safety net of us. I would also kind of talk to young people about their expectation of not feeling anxious and trying to go down to Portmarnock Beach, stick your hands out and trying to stop the waves. It gives you something to do, but ultimately it makes no difference because the emotions are going to keep coming. So 90% of the time on Portmarnock Beach, the waves will come in, they will trickle past your ankles, and they pass back out every time when we barely notice them. And that's most of the time when we get anxious. It comes, it goes, and we don't notice it very often. Maybe 5% of the time we get a strong wind, a bit of a storm, it comes in, hits us in the midriff, and it hurts a little, and then it passes back out. But that's a couple of times a year. Once or twice a year, a massive wave comes in, it hits us in the face, knocks us to the ground, it really, really hurts us, and then it passes. So again, what we're trying to do and show is that anxiety will always be coming. We don't always have to pay attention to it, but no matter what the strength of the anxiety that comes, it will always pass if we give it time to. Again, similar to what I mentioned a few minutes ago, validation, the key tool that we use for in many scenarios of therapy and mental health, and particularly with DBT for young people who are extremely suicidal, we will validate them and validate the pain of the emotion they're going through. It also works with anxiety. Also relating to ourselves. You know what? I get it. I used to be scared of. And when I give these talks to parents groups exclusively in schools, and I put up a big picture of a massive tarantula, you see that sense of fear that comes up straight away there. So you can empathize, you can validate, you can connect with them and explain it. Particularly, I see how hard this is for you. With CBT, which many of you may be familiar with, it's cognitive behavior therapy. And in my experience, certainly from delivering it with people who struggle with anxiety, the cognitive side of things, so the understanding, the thinking, the thoughts, in my experience, only accounts for a maximum of perhaps maybe 20% of an improvement that can come when we try to manage anxiety. 80% comes from the behavior. I see that as the most important piece, where the person experiences it, because it's safe in the room talking about what they might do, how they might do it, because they don't have to do it and it's not increasing their anxiety. But in that real world situation, that follow through is the most difficult thing for them to do. But when I'm working with someone who gets anxious, this is the key phrase for me. As soon as they say this, and I'll make a big deal in my notes, I'll write it in twice as big letters, put circles around it, put stars beside it, and they go, what's he getting so excited about this about? Because it's the first time that their anxiety is challenged. It's a big deal, but also it allows them to think back and go, hang on, I spent all week believing in these catastrophic events. It didn't happen. How come? So what we're trying to do is undermine anxiety's ability, or the perception of anxiety's ability to predict the future, and that it isn't as bad as they thought it was going to be. And it's been very rare, if ever, it has been as bad as they predicted. But it's about supporting them to have that experience. And them living through it, I would argue, is far more important than any reassurance I or anyone else could give them, because they've lived it. Many of you will know about the idea of a graded hierarchy, so that if you were terrified of public speaking, you wouldn't ask them to go in and give a talk to 200 people in the school, because it would feel so overwhelming. So that in conjunction with the young person, you would draw up a hierarchy of, say, for example, thinking about a spider, not being very, very anxious about it, up unto 100 would be letting a spider crawl on your arm, and building that anxiety. And I would explain to them that this is designed to make you anxious deliberately, so that you will build confidence in managing anxiety. And this is the way that it will work. It's also about embracing it and surrendering to it. Some of you may or may not know what that image is with the two fingers. It's known as a Chinese finger trap. And with this piece, it's just a tube. And when you put your fingers into it, when you try to pull them out, it constricts and it holds you and it keeps you trapped there. So when we try to avoid situations, the same thing happens. It keeps us trapped within our anxiety. And what we have to do to manage the anxiety is the opposite of our instincts. And with this, the only way to release your fingers is to move towards it. So it's about trying to, in an empathic, supporting way, help our teenagers to move towards the anxiety that they're feeling, rather than run away from it. And when we move towards it, when we surrender to it, then it allows us to move free from it. It's also about helping young people to understand and to move their attentional control from inward to outward. And this is where mindfulness can be a useful adjunct to some of the other techniques and tools that we would use, where it brings the person's attention outside of their body, so that they don't focus on their heart pounding, they don't focus on their stomach going in knots. They pay attention to the tone of what the person is saying, different aspects of their face or their hair or their smells. Anything that's external allows the person to feel anxious, and for it to pass without us paying attention to it and then reinforcing it. A lot of the stuff, the content in today, because I get asked about it so much, and also about giving a young person a sense of autonomy. Many times when they have a session with me, they will forget, understandably, some of the stuff that I've talked about. I write notes, I can reflect back on them, but many times the young people don't. So I put most of the content of this into a series of blogs that I will divert a young person to, that allows them a sense of independence and autonomy to come back and look at it themselves afterwards, to remind themselves if they need to. Social Anxiety Ireland is a charity that's been running for about 20 years. At the moment, it's only for people age 18 plus, but it has a huge amount of information and techniques and supports that would be as applicable to teenagers or parents who might be experiencing it as well. Thank you, everyone, and happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Great, thanks, Mark. Claire, have you got some of the questions there?
I do. Can you hear me, Mark? Yeah.
Yeah,
thanks. I can. I have a load of questions, but there's some that fall into essentially a category or a theme, and the theme essentially is balance. So what people are interested in is in the balance between giving the young person support, encouraging them to do it themselves, between kind of giving them support and empathy versus kind of pushing them out of their comfort zone. And I suppose of giving them an alternative. So there's somebody here who's talking about providing a service while the young person doesn't go to school and trying to get a balance in that. Does that make sense? So the kind of balance between support, empathy, and enabling the person to be independent and go out of their comfort zone. Yeah,
and I think that's the important piece in terms of the two things there. One would be the validation. So the first piece to come in, rather than trying to change how they're feeling, to validate, say we understand it, we get it, so that they get that sense of connection and there's an alliance between us, be that as a parent or an adult. That's the most important piece, that we see where we're coming from. The second piece then is about validating that while I understand how anxious this is for you, that I can't go along with your anxiety in terms of believing that this worst thing is going to happen, because if I do, I'm colluding with it, and I want to help you to engage with life and find a way that we're going to manage this. And however small the steps need to be, we will keep them small once we're moving forward. That kind of staying still or avoiding isn't helpful. And I know sometimes you're going to get annoyed at me, you're going to be pissed off that I've suggested to do something that's making you anxious. But that, again, that context of building confidence and feeling anxious will help us move towards it. So they need to understand why we're doing it. It's not a command and control thing. I need to do it because I'm your parent and I'm telling you to do so. With teenagers, they're going to get that oppositional response, as they do to many things that we ask them to do. So they need to understand that we're doing it from a place of compassion, that we get it, and that we're trying to help them, and that we need to keep nudging them towards it. So if I'm not going to school at all. Okay, well, look, as a parent, one, that's not up for negotiation. I understand how anxious you are, but we need to find something that you can tolerate while also moving towards, at some point, a reintroduction fully back to school. But if we need to take that in small steps, then okay, we will do that. And also, I'll do it with you. That I'm not expecting you to do this on your own. That yes, you will get upset, and I know you're going to get anxious, and it won't last. And I will be there to support you with it. So it's about the parent being able to, in many cases, tolerate the distress. So that balance can be hard when a parent or an adult sees the person getting excessively, really, really distressed out of proportion to the situation. The instinct is I need to reduce the distress or pull away that thing. So what happens then is we reinforce, we communicate to them, yes, you were right, there is that level of danger. So we as adults need to be able to contain our own anxiety about their distress to achieve that balance and helping them to move forward. So knowing for us as adults that they are going to get anxious, they're going to get upset, and that's a natural part of this, but we need to do it in a way that they can tolerate and manage.
Great, thanks, Mark. Similar, I suppose, to that is the kind of a balance between setting boundaries and managing anxiety. And I think what this person was talking about was the sense that when they try and raise something with their young person, that the response is, oh, that makes me anxious, that makes me anxious. And so it's very difficult to have a conversation with them. Yeah, so timing, I suppose, is important. What doesn't work well is sitting kind of down face to face opposite them, because that in itself, again, we were talking about kind of difficulty with eye contact. And when we feel anxious about something, or when we feel not good enough, so if we're trying to have a conversation with maybe not going outside or not going to school, if we sit directly opposite them, we're looking at them, and by looking at them, they feel we're judging them, we're scrutinizing them. For many young people, they want to get anxious, they want to socialize with their peers, they want to go to school, and they feel ashamed and not good enough, the fact that their anxiety overwhelms them. So going on a walk where the intention isn't to have that conversation, but finding an opportunity to do it, sitting parallel rather than face to face, is something that's quite supportive in doing this. So what we're trying to do is find some opportunities for success. So where they keep saying, I'm not doing it, finding something that they can tolerate, that no matter how small it is, where they experience anxiety and it passes, and then we build from that. A lot of them will, when they hear this conversation from us, think that our expectation is, I do one step and the second step is back to school. So they need to be really reassured that no, there are lots of steps. Yes, we're going back to school and the boundary is you need to go, but that it is in a graded fashion that they can tolerate. And what we might need to do is, if they can't hear that conversation, is draw it out for them in advance. Type it out. Say, look, here's what I was thinking. What do you think? Is this reasonable? Is this too much? Is there anything else that we can put in there? So they mightn't initially, because of their anxiety, be able to be collaborative. We might need to do a little bit of scaffolding first and then allow them to join in. They might look at it and go,
okay, yeah, that's doable, or no, I could never do that. And now we've engaged them in the conversation because they're giving input as to what they could or could not do.
Thanks, Mark. I have a couple of questions, which I think will a lot of people, again, from our clinical experience, are asking this about young people who have specifically Asperger's or diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder, who are experiencing severe and extreme anxiety, which is essentially preventing them from going outside the home. So I think people are really interested in how to support those young people specifically.
So two things with that. One, if they have an awareness, if they know about their ASD diagnosis, they know that social communication, social interaction is something that's particularly challenging for them. And that all sets it up already in terms of their self-doubt about themselves and their ability to do it. But also what we need to check in as a first protocol is, do they understand what they're feeling is anxiety? So for young people who are autistic, they can struggle sometimes to self-label and recognize emotions in themselves. They don't know what's going on. And if they don't recognize the emotion, it can feel very, very catastrophic and feel like they need to get away from it. It's terrifying. Also, with autistic young people, it's really important that we don't overly rely on verbal conversations, because it's a social communication difficulty. So having a discussion about it can be something that they can struggle with. So we know that visuals are better. Visuals are always better. Looking at it, drawing it, having images. One of the things that I use in the blog is I did a series on explaining anxiety through GIFs. And I found with a number of young people on the spectrum, they found that helpful and useful because it's something that they can relate to in terms of technology. And if it's not, then well, you pick the ones, you go on WhatsApp and you pick the GIFs that represent for you how you feel. So it's about using visual communication, both for us to explain what's happening, but for them to also be able to communicate to us. And again, it's using a medium that they're comfortable and familiar with. But again, the visual graded exposure piece is so much more important with autistic young people so that they can see it. That in itself will give them a sense of predictability. But it is definitely more of a challenge than for children who are not autistic.
Thanks, Mark. A couple of questions. I suppose one, I'll pose this and maybe don't answer it, wait for the second part. One is an eating disorder anxiety-based? And then the second question then, again, I think might be relevant to a lot of people, is about young people, say age 12, looking for access to social media like Snapchat and Instagram. They're the only one of their friends who don't have it. But the fear is that allowing that young person to access those ways can actually impact on their body image and, screen time and that sort of stuff. So it seems to be linked to body image. But any suggestions, I guess, for people asking questions like that?
That's a great question about the eating disorders, and I would argue yes. A lot of the approaches that I would use with young people who have eating disorders is similar to anxiety, because essentially what it's about is fear. I'm really terrified. So there's a conditioned response to food. I see food and I associate all food or any food with a catastrophic event of I'm going to get fat, no matter what that food is. And talking to them, they literally terrified that if I eat this food right now, I will become fat immediately. So it's a catastrophic fear-based event. They see it, their heart pounds, they feel nauseous, and particularly nausea at the idea of food. I feel sick at the idea of eating it, because they have a belief that will lead them to being fat. And as an eating disorder, anorexia in particular, progresses, it becomes more distorted and the fear becomes stronger. So they see any food at all or eating as leading to this terrifying feared event. So again, that approach of validating, I understand why you're afraid of it, but it's about this is what your eating disorder, your anorexia is telling you to do. So with younger children, we would separate out the anxiety from them. And with adolescents, we tend to separate out the eating disorder away from the teenager so that we don't get frustrated with them for not eating. And we recognize the strength of the thoughts that the eating disorder is often shouting at them, telling them, increasing their self-doubt. You're fat, your thighs are too big, your arms are too fat, your face is too big, nobody's going to like you. And they will avoid it. So again, it's the safety behavior. If I avoid eating, then I don't need to feel anxious about the fear of getting fat. If I don't look at myself in the mirror, I avoid this sense of shame about my body and reinforce this belief that it's something to be shameful about in the first place. So absolutely, there's a strong anxiety component to eating disorders that we need to recognize. On the second piece around social media, I don't tend to get into much in the area of age ratings in terms of when they should or shouldn't do it. You can get some really mature 12-year-olds who are well able for it, and some who are not. The research would tell us that the link between social media as one of the bigger predictors of whether a young person has a distorted view of their own body image is actually quite small, that it's more that they compare themselves to their peers around them where the greater influence is. But certainly they do make negative comparisons. They are anxious about it. They will use filters to try and give themselves the best image. So I would suggest if a parent, and it ultimately has to be parental discretion and parental monitoring, and a graded use of social media where they can only add a certain number of friends on it for a limited amount of time. And if they're not keeping to those boundaries, then it needs to be reduced a little bit. But it is also, I suppose, in the context of COVID, most young people use Instagram not for pictures, but for texting. So while as adults we might use text or WhatsApp, they use their group-based chats using the chat function on Instagram. So depending on the boundaries you might have it might be that they don't post pictures, but they just use it for that chat function. And we have a conversation with them about it, about educating them about what they see online isn't necessarily reality, that someone will be distorted. And next Tuesday, ISPCC are launching a new digital hub that's going to give advice for parents on how to navigate some of those kind of tricky nuances about young people and social media. That'll be live from Tuesday. So I think that will provide a lot of additional information for parents to guide them. But again, it'll always be ultimately down to kind of parental discretion and them knowing their child and what they're able for.
Thanks, Mark. Are we okay for time, guys? Or I've got one more question here, maybe.
If you just do the last question there, Claire, really quickly, it'd be great.
So the question here in terms of behaviours that young people demonstrate. So, for example, constantly closing doors, rubbing hands, smelling hands, or things of that nature. What's the best way to respond to these behaviours?
That's a difficult one because it depends on what the function of the behaviour is. So for some younger children, maybe creeping in adolescence, it might be a sensory piece that actually might be kind of soothing for them if they're feeling particularly anxious or overwhelmed. For others, it might be down to a belief that an OCD type behavior, that if I do this repetitive behavior, that it prevents a bad thing from happening. So I feel anxious and I keep closing it. And the belief the person is that this has prevented the bad thing happening. So if I keep closing doors, it keeps people from breaking into the house. Or if I keep washing my hand. And again, this is difficult in the world of COVID because before excessive hand washing there wasn't an initial context for it. At the moment, they need to be doing it because this is the constant health message. I need to be doing it. So it's about whether it's excessive and not justified to the level of concern the young person has, but showing kind of a curiosity. So the instinct might be stop closing the doors all the time. And then that's not going to work because we're not trying to connect with why they're doing it. So it might be just noticing you're closing doors a lot there. What's that all about? You worried about anything? So it opens up the possibility of the conversation without them immediately thinking you're going to try and stop me doing it. Because if this is the thing that's reducing their anxiety, they're unlikely to stop that behavior in the absence of, one, understanding why they're doing it, and two, without an alternative to reduce their anxiety without needing to do this behavior that makes them feel better about themselves.
Great. I think that's most of them. I think I've teamed them, and I hope I've gotten to. I think there was another question in terms of approaches and techniques to discuss with people, but I think you've answered that already before I posed the question. So I think I got through them all.
Thank you.
There's lots and lots of thank yous in case you can't see, and lots of that was really helpful, Mark. So.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the kind feedback.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Mark and Claire. Your delivery was excellent, Mark. It was spot on. I never thought I'd see the day when I thought I really enjoyed a webinar on anxiety, but it really gave me the points that I needed to hear. Thanks, Claire, for moderating the questions. It's a job well done. Thanks also to Click Media, who have provided the tech support for the event. And we do have another couple of webinars in this series. Our next one will be on the 20th of May, and I'll send around a poster as soon as it's done. So just one small ask of everybody, you will have an evaluation sheet into your inbox. If you wouldn't mind completing that as soon as possible, that would be great. So that's it from us. Thank you very much for joining us for this afternoon. Thanks again to Mark and to Claire. Slán agus bannacht.
All right. Oh,